And it's now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker of this session, Jane Tiller. She will speak first on the ethical and insurance implications of genome testing. Jane is a lawyer and genetic counsellor with a background in corporate law and a keen interest in the regulatory and ethical aspects of genomics. She is a genetic counsellor with the Victorian Clinical Genetic Services, an ethical, legal and social advisor in public health genomics at Monash University, and the founding member of the Australian Genetic Non-Discrimination Working Group. So please make Jane welcome.
Hello. Now, sorry for unmuting myself earlier. Can everyone now hear me through the mic? Yeah? All right. Good. So as mentioned, I have a background in regulation ethics type issues, and this is something that's really important to think about when we're thinking about genetic testing. I'm happy to take some questions at the end if you are confused about anything I talk about, but hopefully things will become self-explanatory as I speak. So when we're considering the ethical issues around genetic testing, there are a few types of testing that we'll look at in a moment, but there's a number of different ethical things that we want to think about, broadly speaking, when we're thinking about ethical issues. One of them is the importance of individual autonomy. Obviously, it's important to make sure that everybody has a choice around genetic testing. Sometimes in the medical system, there is an expectation that everybody will have testing, will have consent to testing when it is offered to them, but it's important to make sure everybody understands that it's not for everybody and that proper consent and autonomy is preserved. Another one is harms that can arise from inaccurate or incorrect results, and this hopefully occurs less in the clinic and when we're offering testing professionally, but there are often and increasingly other ways that people can access genetic tests and genetic test results that can cause these harms that we need to think about. The next one is the potential for stigmatisation of parents or children after genetic testing is done, or as a result of genetic testing not being done. And this is an example just of this issue which has arisen in the context of screening for Down syndrome, which has become very normalised. It's done for every woman as long as she consents who is pregnant. And this is just an article that talks about what happens when people don't have testing and how people look at that idea of people choosing to have a child with Down syndrome. And I'll just read it. If you ask prospective parents what they want for their child, most would say, I just want them to be happy and healthy. But as prenatal genetic screening and other genetic technologies become more widely available, is happy and healthy enough? Talk to a parent of a child with Down syndrome and they'll be able to tell you a story about screening. They might have been asked in front of their child who has Down syndrome whether they'd had the test. In essence, a parent is being asked to explain why their child was born. Did they decline the test? Did they undergo screening, receive a high chance result and proceed with the pregnancy regardless? Did they receive a low chance result and find out post-birth that their child had Down syndrome? And it's really important as we think about testing and as we offer more and more genetic testing to understand that not everybody has the same view of genetics and not everyone has the same view of what is normal and acceptable in terms of children and reproduction. The next issue is insurance discrimination issues, which I'll go through in quite a bit of detail at the end of the talk, and then confidentiality and security of data, which is really important if we are having testing, especially testing that might not happen onshore, testing that happens overseas, in terms of understanding and knowing what's happening with that data. Sorry, people over there, I've got my back to you. So types of genetic testing where you might be able to have testing and you might be thinking about these include direct-to-consumer testing. And this is testing that you can order on the internet. You might spit in a tube and send it away to a company. Often at the moment, these companies are based in America, so that data is being sent overseas and then you get results back to you. Sometimes through a medical professional, sometimes it will come directly back into your inbox. And there are some things we need to think about when thinking about that kind of testing. The next one is biobank or research testing. So you might be involved in a hospital or a clinic who says, we're doing some research and would you like to have a genetic test? Would you like to have a genetic test for your child as part of this research project? Again, that's a different type of testing with some things that you need to think about. And the third is clinical genetic testing, which is standard testing offered in a clinic through a laboratory, usually through your clinician or through a hospital that you're involved in. When we think about direct-to-consumer testing, you might have heard of companies like 23andMe, Ancestry. These are the biggest companies at the moment who are offering this kind of testing. In Australia, you can't get medical testing results from these companies directly, but you can send them to places like Promethease, Genetic Genie, and others who will interpret that data and will give you a spit out of what they say might be in your genetics. Now, this sounds amazing. It doesn't cost very much, and you can just upload it onto the internet and get all of this information. However, there are things you need to think about before doing that as well. This isn't always accurate information. It's not always information that you can understand and interpret for yourself. And before doing those kind of things, you need to keep a few things in mind. The first is understanding the limits of what is possible. If you're thinking about doing this kind of testing, you need to understand what the testing can tell you. There's all sorts of genetic testing out there that says that it can tell you whether your kid's going to be good at soccer, whether you've got all sorts of genetic traits for different kinds of things. The fact that a company tells you they can tell you that information doesn't mean they necessarily can, or that the information is accurate. The second one is making sure you're prepared for the information that you can receive from this kind of test. Often people do testing with these kind of companies looking for a certain type of information, and they end up finding out things like their child is not of the parentage that they expected, or maybe they are not of the parentage that's expected. We find out things like that sometimes. And that's okay if you're prepared for it, but you need to make sure that you think about all the types of data that can come to you and the information you might receive before you do this kind of test. Third one is considering the medical follow-up and support you might need from doing this kind of testing. If you do clinical testing in a hospital, you will have clinicians and people around you who will interpret data, who will tell you what it means and what can be done about it. Testing that you do online doesn't always have all of those supports. You might be left not really knowing what this information means, not really knowing what you can do with it, and not knowing what your avenues are afterwards. Fourthly, you need to think how the results might affect your insurance. Again, I will go into this in a little bit more detail in a moment. And consider who will have access to your DNA and data. Companies like 23andMe do sell their access to their data. It's very clearly spelled out in their terms and conditions, but most people don't read them. But there is a very well-known deal, for example, between 23andMe and GlaxoSmithKline, where a lot of money was paid so that the pharmaceutical company could have access to that data. Now, it's not always identifiable data. They might not be able to contact you directly, but they do sell access to sets of their data for research and sets of their data for mining by companies like GSK. You might be okay with that, and if you are, that's fine, but make sure you think through and you check what will happen to your data before you do that kind of test. Second type of testing is research-driven testing, and things that you want to think about when you're considering whether to have testing in this context. Will you receive personal results from the testing? Now, this should be made clear to you, but just because someone's doing a research test and asking for your sample and asking to look at your DNA or your child's DNA doesn't mean that they will necessarily give you the results of that research. It may be that the research is being done at a population level. They want to look at lots of data, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you or your child will be getting the results back. This can cause a bit of confusion and a bit of angst for people who feel like they are donating something to a research study and then they don't feel like they get anything out of it personally. How will your sample and other data be stored? Now, if this research study is being done through a reputable institution with good ethics clearance, this should all be done in a way that is ethical and protects your confidentiality, but it's a question that you should ask and be aware of if someone wants to take your DNA and do research on it. Where will the sample be stored? How will it be stored? Who will have access to it, and what will they be doing with it? Will further research be done on that DNA sample? So usually you can give consent for this kind of thing. You can say that further research can be done, or you can say, I don't want further research to be done on that sample. But it's good to just make sure you understand what's being done with your sample after the research you've signed up for has been completed. Will you be contacted again if further testing is done? So again, if you've said, yes, that's fine, further research can be done, is that something that is going to come back to you? Will they be contacting you to let you know of the research that they've found? And will you be able to change your mind about being part of the research study in future? So important to know at the beginning, if you change your mind partway through, what you can do, who you need to contact about that. Thirdly, clinical genetic testing. This is one that's offered in the hospital or the clinic directly where you might be involved. And a few things to think about when you're considering whether you want to have this testing. What will and won't the genetic test be able to tell you? So a genetic counsellor or a genetic specialist should talk to you about this, but make sure that you understand before you have the testing what you can and can't find out. Sometimes research is very uncertain, and also clinical genetic testing is sometimes uncertain. We don't have all the answers yet. And so if you're having genetic testing, you might think, oh good, I'm going to get an answer now. And sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. And that's good to be prepared for when you're going into this odyssey of having genetic testing. What are the types of outcomes you might get from genetic testing? What are the insurance implications of the information? I keep talking about that because it's something that everybody asks about. And what will happen to your data? Again, in a clinical setting, that should be looked after in a very ethical way, but good to make sure you understand what's going to happen to it in future. And number 5, we'll be contacted again if more opportunities for genetic testing come up. This is good to understand in clinical settings because some clinics will have mechanisms for that and some will not. So what about insurance, discrimination and insurance? Just a show of hands for interest, how many of you have thought about being concerned about genetic discrimination and insurance in the past? Yeah, so something that some people are concerned about, some people have never thought about until it's raised with them. It's something that has had some recent policy changes recently, which I'll go through, but has been quite concerning for a lot of people involved in research and genetic testing historically. So under Australian law, genetic testing companies, insurance companies are allowed to ask for your genetic test results when you make an application for life insurance cover. And that's something that they're allowed to do, and they're allowed to discriminate. They can refuse to cover you. They can increase your premium on the basis of genetic test results that show an indication for disease. There is a new life insurance policy which has come into play recently, but the law has not changed. So under law, they're allowed to discriminate as long as there is evidence for it. They're allowed to discriminate on those genetic test results. Health insurance is not affected by this. So under law, health insurance companies cannot ask for your genetic test results or discriminate on the basis of them or other health and lifestyle information. So health insurance companies offer community rated insurance to everybody on the same basis. Employers are also not allowed to use genetic test results to discriminate. So it's really only life insurers under Australian law that have that ability to use this information to discriminate against you. So there is a requirement that life insurance companies take into account risk reducing measures. So if you have a genetic test and it shows that you have a high risk of a certain disease, like a cancer, and then you take measures like surgery or screening which reduce that risk down, an insurance company should take that into account as well when they make their decision. There is very little government oversight over this. So even though they are supposed to do that, unfortunately, it's not very well looked after by the government. There is not a lot of oversight, and there's not a lot of ability for people to have that looked at. And that's something that we are looking at on a policy basis. The insurance industry sets its own policy, and that's the policy change that we'll talk about. And so it's completely self-regulated by the industry. These financial concerns, like I said, have been seen again and again to deter uptake of genetic testing in research and in the clinic. So people are not having testing because they're concerned about some of these things. So life insurance concerns are obviously only important for adults. And I know for a lot of people in this room, they'll be thinking about genetic testing for children. So it's important to know that we don't know what the law will be like or what the policy will be like when people who are children now become 18 or older and need to think about life insurance. It's hard to say what's going to happen in the future. If you are concerned about your child's potential life insurance concerns when they become an adult. Obviously, that may be something that they have to think about. However, it's also important to keep in mind genetic testing will increase a lot over the next 20 years. There is a lot of things that will happen. And so if it's the only reason that you're considering not having genetic testing for your child, and there's a really good clinical reason to have testing, it's probably not the best reason to not have testing on that basis. Obviously not relevant for children until they are adults. Important to know that even when they are adults, you don't have to disclose anyone's genetic test results to an insurer other than your own. So if your child was to have genetic testing and they found something, and when your child was an adult, they applied for life insurance and the law was exactly the same as it is now, then they would have to disclose that. But they wouldn't have to disclose your genetic test results or their siblings' genetic test results or anybody else. It's only your own personal results that have to be disclosed. Like I said, some parents decline genetic testing in children because of these concerns, but genetic testing will become far more common in the next 20 years. We eventually will probably get to a point where all children are tested at birth, and this idea of whether or not you have genetic test results in your possession will probably become much less of an issue as the testing increases over the years. This is just a little diagram to show you lots of other countries that have been concerned about genetic discrimination and have implemented laws or other ways of making sure this doesn't happen. And because of that, we in Australia started the Non-Genetic Discrimination Working Group. And this is a group of professionals who work on this issue on a policy basis. And we are all committed to trying to make sure that genetic discrimination for consumers is hopefully eradicated, but at least that the government is looking at it and that solutions are being considered. So back in 2017, there was an inquiry into this issue, or into the whole life insurance industry. And we went and we spoke in Canberra about this issue, and we asked the politicians for an urgent moratorium, which is like a fancy word for a ban on using genetic test results in life insurance, and to look at long-term regulation solutions. About a year later, the Parliamentary Inquiry released their report. In that report, they recommended that there would be a moratorium on genetic test results in life insurance, similar to a moratorium that's in place in the UK. In the UK, they have an agreement between the government and the life insurance industry where they agree not to use that other than in one very rare circumstance. Unfortunately, the government has not done anything about it and has not implemented that, but the Financial Services Council, which is the insurance body in Australia, has brought in a policy change where they have agreed up to certain limits that they will not ask for or use genetic test results when you're applying for life insurance. Now, this is the fact sheet. I'm not sure how easy that is to read, but those limits are $500,000 of death cover. So that means if you take out a policy that's worth $500,000 or less, you don't have to tell the insurer anymore about the genetic test results that you have. If your policy is worth more than $500,000, you still have to tell them what the results are, and they can discriminate on that basis. You also have to disclose your medical history, so that hasn't changed, and the medical history of your first-degree relatives, but only your first-degree relatives. So if you're looking at a medical condition that has a genetic basis and it runs in the family, you have to tell them about your mum, your siblings and your children, your dad, parents, but you don't have to tell them about your grandma or your aunt or your cousin. They only require you to tell them about first-degree relatives. You don't have to take a genetic test to apply for life insurance. They can't say, oh, we'll give you life insurance if you take a test, but if you've taken the test and it's over that amount, then you do have to tell them about it. No problem. I think I'm getting the hurry up. So I will, I would just do this slide. We are concerned about this moratorium. It's better than it used to be, but it's not ideal. It's still self-regulated, so there's no government involvement. It doesn't apply to travel insurance, and there are limits on it. So it's very, it's much better than it was, but it's not ideal as yet. There you go. Thank you.
some questions?
Yeah, sure.
If you have any questions for Jane, please just indicate and we'll get the mic around to you.
Yes, so the question was, is life insurance the only type of insurance where discrimination can occur? Yes, life insurance covers life, disability, income protection. So all of the types of life insurance that you would get from a life insurance provider, they are allowed to discriminate on. Health insurance, no. Travel insurance, they can discriminate as well. There's often not a lot of evidence base behind it, so it can be challenged, but travel insurers technically can and sometimes do make funny decisions on the basis of genetic test results. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane, very much. Thank you.